When I took general biology, bar none, the hardest and most boring part of the whole class was photosynthesis and cell respiration. There's some other tricky stuff, but for me, these two were the worst because there's just so much going on. The Calvin cycle, glycolysis, the electron transport chain. It's easy to get lost and not know where to start. So what if we approached all this in a different way? If you're struggling with learning about photosynthesis and respiration, this might be the video for you. Personally, I learn best when things are compared to each other because it gives me a frame of reference. Like, this thing does this as opposed to that. And this works perfectly here. Because while these are complex processes with lots of details, if you zoom out and look at the big picture, you start to notice something really cool. Photosynthesis and cell respiration are opposites in just about every major way. Now, you are taught this to some extent, like how photosynthesis turns water and carbon dioxide into sugar and oxygen, while respiration does the opposite. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. It goes way deeper, and I don't think many people realize just how many parallels there are. So let's break it down. Now, I'm going to assume that you've either already learned about photosynthesis and respiration at least once, or you're actively learning about them in school right now. If you haven't learned about them at all and you're going in blind, I'll try to catch you up, but you might want to watch some of the videos in the description first. We'll start with a brief overview of photosynthesis and then respiration. Then we'll compare them beat for beat. I'm going to keep things semi-broad and not get too in the weeds. So just keep in mind that I'm going to skip or simplify a lot of stuff. For example, we're not going to go over every step of the Krebs cycle, but we will talk about its overall purpose and what goes in and out of it. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into it. Here's a quick recap of photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis is to use light to make food. In a nutshell, light is used to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar, or glucose, with oxygen given off as waste. Photosynthesis is mainly done by plants and algae and some other microbes like cyanobacteria, and it allows them to make their own food instead of eating stuff like we do. Photosynthesis has two main parts, the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. The light reactions turn water into oxygen and create both electrons and energy. The Calvin cycle then uses the electrons and energy to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. The light reactions also have something called an electron transport chain. Remember that, it'll be important later. In eukaryotes, photosynthesis usually happens in cell organelles called chloroplasts. Inside chloroplasts, there are little hollow structures called thylakoids. They look like stacked discs. The space inside the thylakoids is called the lumen. The light reactions happen in the membrane of the thylakoids, while the Calvin cycle happens in the space outside the thylakoids, called the stroma. Now for respiration. The purpose of cell respiration is to turn food into energy. Respiration is basically the opposite of photosynthesis. In a nutshell, sugar is broken down to make energy, with carbon dioxide and water given off as waste. While photosynthesis is only done by certain organisms like plants and algae, almost everything does respiration, at least in some form. Respiration has three main parts: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. We'll call it OXPHOS for short. Glycolysis splits glucose into a smaller molecule called pyruvate, and also makes a little bit of energy. The Krebs cycle then breaks pyruvate down into CO2 in order to get electrons. OXPHOS then uses these electrons to make energy, and it does this using an electron transport chain, just like the light reactions. In eukaryotes, respiration mostly happens in the mitochondria, except for glycolysis, which happens outside the mitochondria in the cell's cytoplasm. Inside the mitochondria, there's a wrinkly inner membrane with lots of folds called cristae. OXPHOS happens in this membrane while the Krebs cycle happens in the space inside, called the matrix. The space between the inner and outer membrane is called the intermembrane space. Alright, now for the fun part. Photosynthesis and respiration have a lot in common, so let's compare them. We'll start with their purpose. The purpose of photosynthesis is to use energy to make food, while the purpose of respiration is to turn food into energy. Or more specifically, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. ATP is a molecule used to store energy for a short time, kind of like a battery. Anytime a cell needs energy to do something, it breaks down ATP. ATP and energy are not the same thing, but I might use them interchangeably to keep things simple. Both photosynthesis and respiration make ATP at some point, but the key difference is that photosynthesis uses it all up, so it's a net zero, while respiration makes way more than it uses, so it's a net positive. And this makes sense, because the purpose of photosynthesis is to build sugar. It only needs to make enough ATP to sustain itself, while the purpose of respiration is to make energy, so it ends up with a surplus. By the way, photosynthesis has 2 main parts, while respiration has 3. So to make some comparisons a little easier, I might ignore glycolysis or combine it with the Krebs cycle, because even though these are 2 separate processes, they still work together to break down glucose. With that said, you might notice that photosynthesis and respiration both have some sort of cycle and an electron transport chain, but they happen in reverse order. Photosynthesis has a chain first and then a cycle, while respiration has a cycle first and then a chain. Isn't that cool? Dude, when I first realized this, it made learning about this stuff go from painfully boring to actually kind of interesting. Now, looking at the cycles, there's a lot going on, so don't worry about the intermediate molecules, just focus on what goes in and out and whether the carbon molecules get bigger or smaller. To really simplify things, the purpose of the Calvin cycle is to build sugar using CO2, electrons, and hydrogen ions, or protons, while the purpose of the Krebs cycle and glycolysis is to break sugar down into electrons, protons, and CO2. So in the Calvin cycle, carbon molecules go from small to big, while in the Krebs cycle, they go from big to small. This means that in the Calvin cycle, CO2 is an integral ingredient, while in the Krebs cycle, it's just waste. Note that the Calvin cycle uses up ATP, while the Krebs cycle makes ATP. The Calvin cycle also uses electrons that come from the electron transport chain, while the Krebs cycle makes electrons that go to the electron transport chain. What's more, the Calvin cycle happens above the membrane that has the chain, while the Krebs cycle happens below that membrane. Now, in order to move electrons between a cycle and a chain, we need something called an electron carrier, a molecule that picks up electrons and puts them somewhere else, kind of like a bus or a shuttle. In photosynthesis, it's something called NADPH, while in respiration, these molecules are NADH and FADH2. Don't worry about the names too much, they basically do the same thing. Anyway, in photosynthesis, these carriers take electrons from the transport chain and move them to the Calvin cycle, while in respiration, they take electrons from the Krebs cycle and move them to the transport chain. Side note, these carriers also transport hydrogen ions, or protons. These protons were formed at the same time as the electrons, so they came from water in photosynthesis and from glucose in respiration. This makes sense when you remember that hydrogen is found in both water and glucose, and a hydrogen atom is made of 1 proton and 1 electron. With that said, let's take a closer look at these chains. Here's how an electron transport chain works. Basically, there's a bunch of proteins in a membrane. Their job is to move hydrogen ions to one side of the membrane. To do this, they need energy, which they get from electrons. Electrons flow through these proteins, allowing them to pump the ions to one side of the membrane. Okay, so what's the point of that? Well, right after the end of the chain is a protein called ATP synthase that spins and makes ATP. Think of it like a little motor that needs a current in order to spin. And that current is made of protons. So because there's more protons on one side of the membrane, that creates pressure that forces them to the other side through ATP synthase, causing it to spin and make ATP. While we're here, a really cool detail is that in the light reactions, protons are pumped inside the membrane, while in oxphos, they're pumped outside. This means that ATP synthase is literally flipped between the light reactions and oxphos. It faces up in the light reactions and down in oxphos. Pretty neat. But wait, what happens to the electrons after all this? Well, once the electrons pass through the protein pumps, they go to something called a final electron acceptor. In the light reactions, it's an electron carrier, and in oxphos, it's oxygen. You need this acceptor to keep the electron flow going. If there's no final acceptor, the whole chain stops. So protons don't get pumped, and no ATP is made. This is why we need to breathe oxygen. When someone's dying of lack of oxygen, they're really dying from lack of energy, because they run out of ATP to power their cells. So in a nutshell, electrons flow through proteins, causing them to pump a bunch of hydrogen ions to one side of the membrane to build pressure. Then they all flow to the other side through ATP synthase, causing it to make ATP. And all of this happens for both the light reactions and oxphos. This raises a question though. If these two processes basically do the same thing, why do the light reactions need light but oxphos doesn't? Well, one key difference is that their inputs and outputs are reversed. In the light reactions, water is turned into oxygen by removing electrons and protons, while in oxphos, oxygen is turned into water by adding electrons and protons. What's more, this reaction happens at the beginning of the chain in the light reactions, while in oxphos it's at the end. This also means that in the light reactions, the electron carriers pick up electrons at the end, while in oxphos they drop off electrons at the beginning. In other words, in the light reactions, electrons go from a water-oxygen reaction to an electron carrier, while in oxphos they go from an electron carrier to an oxygen-water reaction. So what does this have to do with light? Well, these two processes get their electrons from different places. In oxphos, electrons come from electron carriers. These guys readily give up electrons. They don't put up much of a fight. Just, okay, here you go. But in the light reactions, they come from water. And water isn't so generous. You'll take these electrons from my cold, dead hands. So the light reactions need energy to split up the water and get those electrons. And that energy comes from light. This leads us to one final opposite. Well, kinda. In oxphos, as electrons travel down the chain, they lose energy because they're used to power the protein pumps. This happens in the light reactions too, but these electrons also gain energy. Twice, actually. Look right here. In addition to protein pumps, the light reactions also have two things called photosystems filled with chlorophyll. The job of the first one is to use light energy to split water and get electrons. And when this happens, the electrons also gain energy, at least for a bit. Then they lose that energy to power a protein pump. But after that, they go to a second photosystem and gain energy again. The question is, why? Electrons never gain energy in oxphos, and it does its job just fine. And at this point in the light reactions, the electrons already went through the pump. So why charge them up a second time? The answer has to do with where the electrons go when all of this is over. In oxphos, the final electron acceptor is oxygen. Once it gets those electrons and turns into water, it's a waste product. So the electrons don't need energy because they don't need to do anything. They're done. You hear me? Done. But in the light reactions, the final acceptor is an electron carrier that takes these electrons to the Calvin cycle. So they still got a job to do. They need energy so they can combine with CO2 to make sugar. But wait, the electrons in respiration need energy too, because they power the protein pumps in oxphos. And those electrons came from the Krebs cycle. So why don't they need light over there? Well, because those electrons get their energy when sugar breaks down. Splitting a bigger carbon molecule into a smaller one releases energy that charges them up. No light required. Long story short, photosynthesis uses light energy, while respiration uses chemical energy. Now, stepping back a bit, when I put all of this together for the first time, it blew my mind. Photosynthesis and respiration are complementary in so many ways. Now, sure, there are lots of things that are unique to each process, like rubisco for photosynthesis or pyruvate for respiration, but when you step back and look at what's happening overall, the parallels are everywhere. I put a summary in this table. You can pause if you want. Hopefully this made the daunting task of learning these things just a little bit easier. If you found this video useful, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps a lot. In future videos, I'd be happy to dive deeper into any part of photosynthesis or respiration, or compare other biological concepts like mitosis versus meiosis or DNA replication versus transcription. Cell biology isn't really my specialty, that would be biodiversity and classification, but I have taught university intro bio courses and I just know a lot of biology stuff. If there's anything you think I got wrong in this video, or if there's any more info you want to add, feel free to comment below. I'll add any corrections in the description or in a pinned comment. Hope this helps. Take it easy.